To return to the PACT project itself, for those of you who don't know, some of you will be familiar with the PACT project now, and some of you I know have been engaging quite closely with it, but some of you it might be more unfamiliar to you, so I just wanted to give you a wee bit of background as to what PACT actually is. It was set up in 2018 as part of a joint commitment between the EIS and the Scottish Government to deliver a programme, a package of professional learning for all teachers in Scotland, not only EIS members, all teachers in Scotland, on the impact of poverty in education, and you know, a little bit of guidance and learning and interrogation of teachers can seek to try to mitigate the impact of poverty, and that would be in terms of, you know, what goes on in schools in relation to policy, in relation to ethos, and in relation to pedagogy. Sandra Scott and Kate Laughlin, who you're going to hear a lot from later on in the webinar, they were recruited early on in the process to design and begin the delivery of this national professional learning offer. And what we were setting out at the beginning to do was create something that teachers would be able to experience face-to-face, you know, in a kind of face-to-face professional learning type experience, but also to make it available online for anybody who wasn't able to participate face-to-face. And we also wanted to produce some hard copy materials as well, so that the project has had maximum possible reach, and was able to reach as many people as possible. And as I said, you're going to hear both from Sandra and Kate later on in the webinar. The project was initially titled as the very catchy Equity Related Professional Learning for Teachers project, and we quite quickly, you know, when the project got up and running, we quite quickly decided that we needed something much more accessible than that. So we came up with PACT because the origins of the programme, the project rather, were this PACT, this joint agreement between EIS and Scottish Government, and we were looking for teachers, for schools, for head teachers, for local communities, and any other education stakeholders that could support this work to kind of become part of the PACT. So you actually, you know, joining this webinar tonight is going to present you with opportunities to engage further and be part of a PACT community as time goes on. We had been on the verge of launching a pilot of the project. We were on the poised to be training trainers. EIS equality reps were to be involved in this, and we had, you know, got the hotels booked and all of that. Everything was about to kick off, and then of course the pandemic struck. So like many other projects and organisations, PACT has had to make a very quick pivot and to kind of like refocus its efforts, realising that it's going to be quite a long time before we're able to do face-to-face type activities. So this event tonight is the first in a series of events and a series of offers that the PACT project is going to make to teachers nationally, you know, to be able to start to think about not only the kind of impact of poverty in education generally, as the project had set out to do, but to think about it specifically in the context of COVID-19. So Kate and Sandra both have been really busy over the last lot of weeks, adapting a lot of the materials that they had already prepared to take account of the situation that we're currently in, and you're going to hear more about that a bit later. You know, really trying to kind of focus in on how our poorest communities and their children and families are being impacted by COVID-19, and how that's going to exacerbate already existing inequalities for those groups. Okay. As you'll know, the recent member survey highlighted quite significant concerns among teachers about the impact that poverty is already having in relation to the COVID-19 context. 65% of our respondents reported lack of access to IT equipment or internet connectivity for children who are trying to learn in a remote capacity at home. There are serious concerns about lack of engagement among large numbers of children. We know that 67% of teachers recognised that their learners were trying to learn in this kind of remote way in the midst of very challenging home circumstances, and we understand that poverty will be right at the heart of a lot of that. And almost half of the respondents reported that many of their children didn't have even adequate workspace, never mind the ICT hardware and the internet connectivity, so not even having desks and chairs and quiet places to work at. So that obviously has implications for just now and what's happening just now with children's learning, what's been happening over the last lot of weeks and months, but it has implications too for what happens when we move to the blended learning model. We know that schools and local authorities have sought to respond to some of that, both through provision of meals, taking packs of learning materials right to children's doors and so on, so that they can engage. And we know that schools have really strived to do as much as they could over the last lot of weeks in relation to that particular issue, and they understand that there's more to be done. Yesterday, the National Records of Scotland published up-to-date figures on the number of COVID deaths by SIMD quintile. We know that SIMD is a flawed measure, but we have to be concerned about the fact that people living in the lowest SIMD quintiles are 2.1 times more likely to die of COVID-19 than those living in more affluent areas. So what we know about the education context and what we know about the kind of social context in which young people are experiencing this pandemic tells us that there has to be a significant job of work done to mitigate, minimise and recover some of the negative impact that those young people have experienced in recent months. The EIS has been highlighting these disadvantages over a number of weeks through all the education recovery work that we've been involved in. We've been flagging consistently that the biggest effort has to be directed towards recovering some of the disadvantage that these young people will have experienced over that period, and we are urging local authorities, national government, to make sure that what is strongly factored into the recovery plans is the additionality of resource that needs to be channeled towards those young people. And so far we have been pretty successful in doing that. Of course, we see a critical role for teachers as they're planning for school reopening, and when schools do reopen, well, hopefully all being well in August, we see a critical role for teachers and head teachers in advocating for the young people that they can see in their classes and in their schools have been most disadvantaged, to make sure that any additionality of resource is channeled in their direction. Otherwise, the long-term consequences are going to be significant. And the PACT project sees its role as being very central to supporting teachers and head teachers to do that. And as I said, this is the first in what's going to be a series of offers to try to help schools and teachers do that. So that's all I'm going to say just now by way of contextualisation. I'm going to hand over just in a little minute to Professor John McKendrick. He is from the Scottish Poverty and Inequality and Research Unit at Glasgow Caledonian University. John is a career-long EIS member. He's been a real friend to the EIS in terms of its anti-poverty campaigning over a long number of years, and he's also a member of the PACT Project Advisory Board, which was set up again at the beginning of the project to help steer the direction of this work. John is going to present for around 10 minutes or so. I would invite you as participants to use the chat function if you would like to make any comments or ask any questions in relation to any of the material that John is going to be presenting to us. And I would ask you all to keep your mics muted, except for John, who has to unmute his so that we can all hear him. Thanks very much, and over to you, John.
So thank you very much. Delighted to be here this evening to ask to come along and share an understanding of what the big picture is within which educationalists must deliver their valued and essential service in these troubled times. I'll touch upon education to a little degree, but the brief that I have then is to look more broadly. Education, like any other service, then must deal with that broad challenge that society faces, and we're now beginning to get information on the nature of that challenge. The title of this presentation that I've given then is Told You So, Reflections on Poverty and Living and Learning Through a Pandemic. And the Told You So is not to be cheeky. The Told You So is really a recognition that both PACT and the wider anti-poverty sector were concerned about these issues beforehand. And what the coronavirus has thrown into sharp relief is the reality of the problems that the PACT project and the anti-poverty sector were trying to address. If people were blind to these problems beforehand, they can't be blind to them anymore. The inequalities that were there pre-existing are much more widely known as a result of the challenges that have been faced. And I just want to share with you a sense of what we're beginning to understand is going on in the wider country at the current time. That's where we started. I mean, we started before the coronavirus crisis with almost 250,000 children in Scotland judged to be living in poverty at the current time. So a ridiculous figure for an affluent country like our own. And we already knew at the start of the crisis that the vast majority of these children were in households with work. So 2/3 of children in Scotland who live in poverty live in a household where somebody works. That was where we were before this crisis kicked in. And we know that we're going to be in a worse place, perhaps not now, but certainly as the country begins to recover and work is not what it was, the earnings that families can get from work are less and fewer families perhaps are able to work, those numbers are going to go up quite substantially. And it's not a Scottish problem, we recognise that. This is a global crisis, and the global poverty estimates are now suggesting that in the world as a whole, that poverty will go back up to over 1 billion. It was 1 billion in 1990 when we had the first proper estimates of poverty. Significant progress was made in the 20 or 30 years since 1990, but now it's looking as if we're going to retract that progress, and globally there are going to be more children living in poverty, and unfortunately Scotland's going to take a share of that too. These are the kind of realities that children have had to face over the crisis. This is my local village, this is my local primary school. Now already the primary school, some of its facilities were locked off and inaccessible to children outside school hours. We know that the restrictions have been placed in some of our sporting facilities when you don't get access out of school hours. So already they weren't able to access them. But in the bottom right hand corner, that's the current state this morning of the children's playground in the town. And to discourage children from using their everyday play space, the local authority took what probably was a sensible step not to maintain that space. So in lots and lots of ways, way beyond education, our children's lives have been disrupted and changed over the course of the last few months. They've not had access to that wider everyday environment, that wider resource. So it's not just a case of learning loss, it's not just a case of the troubles in access and learning. Their broader lives have been ruptured in lots of ways. Their everyday spaces haven't been accessible to them. The school, obviously, but also wider play space and wider connections within their community. I did some research a few weeks ago on behalf of the Poverty and Inequality Commission, and what we were looking at there was how the voluntary sector were measuring up to delivering emergency food to people throughout Scotland. And what we did is we canvassed the opinions of over 200 organisations, 200 community organisations delivering emergency food across Scotland. We asked them how they were getting on just now, so there was a point in time analysis, but we also asked them to look back over the last month and to look forward over the next month and give us their perceptions about how things had changed and how things might improve. The chart in the top left hand of the slide then is how things were perceived to have changed over the last month, and the chart in the bottom right hand of the slide is their perceptions of how things will change over the next month. So looking at mid-May, looking ahead to June just now, and looking back towards mid-April. What came across was a sense of things had improved, but then things were beginning to stall. So there's a dynamism to how Scotland is coping if we just look at this one example of emergency food. The community sector felt things had improved between April and May. The kind of colours on these charts, green is good, orange is sitting in the middle, things haven't changed, and red is bad, things are getting worse. And there's far more green in that top left-hand corner. According to community sector, things were improving between April and May. But if we look at the bottom right-hand corner, how things were expected to change between May and June, then largely it's the same, but also there's more of a shift towards more red in these charts, i.e. there's a perception that things will get worse. And if we look at a couple of these issues in a bit more detail, the emergency food sector were noticing that far more people were coming forward over the last month, so that the red in the very top bar was very, very long. The majority of organisations were saying that more people were presenting for emergency food between April and May. And then looking ahead, they felt that the number of people who would need emergency food would increase even further as we move between May and June. There's also shifts in terms of worker and volunteer wellbeing. So there was a sense that came across that, people were doing well, volunteers were giving of their service and were delivering well, and were managing with that, but were beginning to reach a pinch point, and then looking ahead, there was real concerns about worker and volunteer wellbeing. So more generally in Scotland, I think what I'm trying to suggest through these data is we've done well in this crisis, but we're reaching a point at which things are beginning to get a little bit difficult for us, and things don't look too good over the next month. The challenges that educationalists face are the challenges that are faced by those in the community food sector. We've muddled through, we've done the very best we can, but problems are beginning to emerge. What about the wider country? This then is just one issue, emergency food in Scotland. This is a chart here that charts through time, and it's a regular monitoring that the Office for National Statistics do for the UK as a whole about how people are feeling over the course of the crisis. Now, they look at much more data than the 4 metrics that are in this chart, but the 4 metrics in this chart are an overview of how people are coping with that crisis. So what's it telling us? It's telling us that there were some improvements, but there are significant proportions of people in the UK are worried. Their well-being has been affected. They are showing signs of high anxiety, and also loneliness is something that's quite prevalent. Now, these issues, worries, anxieties, well-being impaired, a sense of loneliness for some, are also relevant to the children that are coming forward. So these are the broader contexts within which children are living their lives just now. These are the broader contexts within educational staff are existing as well. And while there's maybe been some improvement levels of worry, we still have almost 3/4 of adults in the UK last week were reporting that they were worried. We were carrying worries about the current times, as well being significant minorities feeling lonely, anxious, and their well-being impaired. Far too much detail in this chart to go through at any length, but they're collecting lots of information about how adults in the UK are reporting their experiences at the current time, with lower and upper confidence levels, but unable to make plans. Half of the UK adults in the UK just now feel they're unable to make plans. 41% are work affected, and so on and so on. In lots and lots of ways, life has been impacted for the worse over the course of these last few months. And they've collected some information in education too. 2/5 of adults reporting that their oldest or only child, they were asked to focus on one child, was struggling with their education at the current time. This is a point estimate with a large confidence range. And these were the factors that they said that why their child was struggling: lack of motivation, parent support being difficult to deliver, lack of guidance and support, parent not having the knowledge and able to deliver. Now, you know better than I do what the challenges are in education, but the point I just wanted to make in this introductory presentation was these are significant challenges that are impacting upon the children that present in our schools, the workers that are delivering that service in many, many ways. It's a challenging time that we must be aware of these broader contexts. And to go back to the point of the presentation, we knew this in advance. It's no surprise to the people in the PACT project. It's no surprise to informed educationalists that poverty is an issue that we have to address. But we have to realise that the scale of that problem is now going to be far, far greater as we move ahead. And we are trying to deliver an education service in a very, very different context in the next few months. So it's a bigger challenge in education, but education got its part to play. Thank you.
John, thanks very much for that, as usual. You know, very clear, very useful, and very up-to-date data. I'm wondering if anyone has any questions that they would like to put to John, and if so, can you put your question in the chat box, please, and I'll pick it up for you. Is there anything there that particularly struck you, that was particularly relevant to your context, or that you think would need maybe a bit more exploration here? Mine isn't so much a question then, John, maybe more of a comment. What's been sort of striking me in the course of the education and recovery work that I've been involved in? One of the work streams was looking specifically at what the measures needed to be for the young people that you've been talking about, who fit the categories that were maybe being captured by some of that data. And it became quite clear, maybe towards the end of the deliberations of the work stream that was looking at this particular cohort, that what we were setting out to do was not so much to put measures in place that that would or extra measures in place that would address the needs and the concerns and the disadvantage of these young people. It was really how we could best make use of existing resources in order to be able to do that. Now, we know that the Scottish Government has freed up some monies that was otherwise to go to, for example, early education and childcare expansion, and that was to go to PEF funding with quite strict rules around how that money was supposed to be spent. And there has been some additional money dispersed to local authorities and some to individual schools. I think just last week another £50 million or so that was going directly to 73 schools who hadn't been involved in the Scottish Attainment Challenge work up until that point. But my impression, and the impression of some of the others on the group, was that our hands were very much tied in terms of what we could actually suggest in the way of practical interventions, because there was not enough money forthcoming to enable that. So I don't know if you have any insights into that, John, as to what the kind of like what funding tensions need to be resolved. And we're again another EIS meeting today, again talking about the perennial tensions between national government and local government in terms of who's going to pay for what. So any insight that you can offer in that regard would, I think, be of interest to certainly to myself and other participants.
Yeah, I mean, there's no good news there. I mean, I think the real difficulty is that the resources required by local authorities has been pulled in so many different directions. I mean, the emergency food problem is not going to go away. It's likely then that there'll be employment problems. People will be underemployed, or will find that furlough stops and work stops at the end of furlough, and the demands in emergency food will continue. So that has to be funded, and that wasn't a resource that was required beforehand. So I think education is in a bun fight, and while obviously it's vitally important, and while within that broader education sector, I think school education should and will fare more favourably compared to higher education. I think that tends to be the way that school education, quite rightly so, I think its needs are more pressing than higher education. I think here is a turkey voting for Christmas, but I think that the broader reality is that there are so many competing demands on money just now that education will have a tough time to vire in more resource. I think the Pupil Equity Fund's interesting because a lot of PEF money was used for a wide range of projects that were interactive, and that PEF money has to be used in different ways. Some of it was like in personal development, and if we think about it now, with children that are looking to attend school 2 days per week, all of the PEF projects that have been used over the last few years will have to be re-evaluated. And that's just another thing to factor in for schools. They've got other decisions to make as well about resources. Incredibly difficult time, but I don't think there's a good news, a pot of gold in the horizon for education.
Maybe on the bright side, John, we know that the Scottish Government has put aside something in the region of £30 million to try and tackle digital poverty, and there's quite a lot in the chat around that. How I mean, it was clear from the outset that so many families were being kind of disenfranchised from the remote learning offer because they simply did not have the kit to enable their kids to participate or the internet connectivity. So the Scottish Government has pledged this £30 million, £9 million of it to buy laptops and things like that. And I know that process has already begun. But have you any thoughts on that? That particular area, and also there's someone's highlighting here the kind of intersectionality of poverty and experience of being from a minority ethnic community. There'll obviously be language issues, there that need to be considered. A lot of kids who have English as an additional language support ordinarily in school have not been getting that kind of input, while the school closures have been underway. So any thoughts that you have around digital poverty, the digital divide, and something maybe about BME families there would be helpful also, John?
Sure, yeah. I mean, Glasgow might have been ahead of the curve. I mean, Glasgow obviously had before the coronavirus crisis, had committed then to get the tablets accessible to its school population. And Glasgow might have been slightly better placed than other authorities if that rollout was successful. I think it's this idea about PACT knew beforehand, the anti-poverty sector knew beforehand. We knew these inequalities existed. Now we have to deal with them. Now, if we want our kids to learn, we simply have to get that kit out to them. We have to begin to redress that digital divide that was there. Now, I don't want to present the corona crisis as being a good thing because, suddenly we're beginning to deal with these long-standing problems that were there. But you know, at least we are beginning to acknowledge that there were problems, and we have to find a solution to them, and hopefully that stands us in good stead going forward. BME families, yes, but I think we have to acknowledge it's not just BME families, that maybe the family is not able to provide support to the learners for a whole variety of reasons. There are a wide range of parents that are not able to provide that support. We know education is a profession. It's not something that everybody can do. It doesn't come naturally to everybody. The dynamic between teacher and pupil is a very different dynamic between parent and pupil. So for a whole range of pupils, this home learning is not something that's going to be easy to do, even with the directed support that you have from teachers. Yes, it's magnified for BME families. It's also magnified for those that have literacy problems that are not from a BAME background. So there's a whole range of different parental and family circumstances that you knew about anyway, but we have to now find a way of managing that, because, you know, at least 2 days per week of learning is going to be in the home space.
And Joan, that point that you make about you know, this kind of like quite unique interaction between children and their teachers is the subject of the next question. There's a suggestion from one of our participants that that interaction and that relationship has been taken for granted, and the coronavirus pandemic has really shone a light very brightly on just how essential that relationship is and that classroom face-to-face experience is. Any thoughts on that in relation to the
Yeah, I mean, I've got different views on this, or different perspectives on it, rather. My daughter's a primary school teacher, and I have a younger daughter who's in primary school as well. And my eldest daughter's frustrated because she's missing that interaction. She's missing that sense of being able to work with her kids in a meaningful way. And for a lot of the kids, are simply not engaging, or at least she doesn't know they're engaging, because there isn't that two-way flow of information. So
I'm now going to introduce our second speaker. She is Joan Lennon. She's a primary teacher of 40 years. She's a school EIS rep. She's also the South Lanarkshire Local Association Assistant Secretary, and she's a member of the National EIS Equality Committee. Joan's school is in an area of deprivation, and we've invited her here to speak this evening because she's been involved in teaching both in the remote learning capacity but also in hub provision over the course of the last few months, and she has got some quite interesting things to convey to us about this whole issue of deprivation, disadvantage, and how this has been really kind of accentuated for children and young people in the current context. So I'll hand over to Joan, and similarly, if you've got questions, if you send them to me, and I'll put them to Joan when she's finished speaking. Thanks.
Welcome everyone, thank you for inviting me, and it's really good to see everybody, and hopefully you can hear me speak to me after. I'll just go quickly into it. This was compared like me teaching in the front line, but I'm going to compare it to like COVID-19 came in like a storm, and very, very quickly we had to abandon ship on the 20th of March. And with that, when we abandoned ship, we took away vital resources for our most vulnerable children. We took away mindfulness, we took away the safe, secure environment, the continuity that they had, the free meals, the friendship groups, the interventions that they take place, the small times that they sit with support assistants, and most importantly, we are a tactile school. We enjoy that interaction with our children, and when our children are stressed, we enjoy time with them to speak to them one-to-one, but also our children enjoy cuddles. They need hugs. They need to tell us that they're sad or they are down, and they need to tell you that these things, and we need to react to that. For some of our most vulnerable children, this will not be a safe, nurturing environment that they're going home to. We can't presume that every child is returning to that kind of environment, and through no fault of their own, because poverty is not a choice. We don't choose to be poor, and these children don't choose to be poor. They already were at a disadvantage. I have to agree with Joan that they're going to go into an education that's going back to a greater advantage. When we abandoned ship, we quickly had to regroup, and we had to set up communication, and this communication came in the form of digital and remote learning. I agree with some people that put up questions. We have to recognise that there are all kinds of poverty. There are hidden poverties, and one of the most major ones that has been recognised and has been highlighted and brought forward is digital poverty. We cannot presume that everyone has got access to a computer, has got access to internet, to broadband. And even this assumption that parents and children have the ability and the technical skills to access all these things. I didn't. I found it really, really stressful, and I know a lot of my colleagues did too. So that was another, you know, real stress that we had to do. But we had to connect with these children. We had to keep that communication going. So we set up all sorts of digital platforms. We have our Seesaw, we had our Twitter, which were already established. We had our school app, but we had our Google Classroom. And then what we had to do is to try and establish some kind of routine so that the children felt that there was still this continuity there. And the routine that we would put in, we would put it into close like a working day. We saying hello to them in the morning, saying it at lunchtime. But the really challenging thing was accessing resources. So what we had to do is we had to poverty-proof our resources, and that word poverty-proof should be embedded in every policy, in every school, and every educational document. If people are not poverty-proofing, you know, resources, then they should be. We cannot make the presumption that everybody has access to all these resources. When I was putting resources on, I had to make sure that I wasn't making it was equitable and fair to all children. Everybody had a chance to access this. So I couldn't presume that, you know, parents had access to pens and crayons or paint. I had to go back to the drawing board and think, well, that's not going to work. I couldn't, you know, I couldn't put something on and say, well, everybody can edit that on Word. Not everybody has the Word on their computer. Not everybody has Word or, you know, our computer. There might only be one computer in that house, and that's been shared by lots of children there. So therefore we had to take all these things into account. We had to also take into account the parents that were, you know, supporting their children through this remote learning, who were obviously going through great stress and strain themselves. One family in particular in my school, whose mother is an absolute amazing person, is supporting 5 children as a single parent, sees education as her way for our children to get out of this rut, as she sees, was in a completely devastating position, accessing food. Her source for, you know, free meals, feeding 5 children at home was proving to be, you know, an absolute burden. She was supported highly with our head teacher, our SMT, who are excellent, who recognise this and who take on this pastoral role, and that can't be underestimated. When we take on board that we teach these vulnerable children, we take on board their families. We have a holistic approach to that as well, because when we're supporting them, we're supporting the families, and the families are missing us now. They're missing that pastoral support. They see there's a void there for them. So there was a recognition of that, and we had to, you know, recognise that in what we're doing, trying to keep the children, trying to keep them engaged with what they were doing, trying to keep them interested, trying to support the parents was a challenge as well, and trying to help us as educationalists and as a community, supporting ourselves on Microsoft Teams, saying that was good, that was a great resource sharing. There was great sense of camaraderie between our staff, and still goes on. These challenges are going to go on, and we can see them going into coming back into class. I was in school, and when I went back in school, I was reminded of the Mary Celeste, and I can see some of my wee children absolutely being traumatised at having to sit at a desk, at not being able to move, not being able to give their friends a hug, not being able to give their teacher a hug. And remember, all behaviour is communication, so we are a very visual, teachers are visual. We look at all these things, we look at the way children interact, we look at the way the children are sitting, are moving. I can tell when some children come in, they've not had a good day, they've not had a good weekend. Monday's always one day where actually you have to think, well, this is going to not be a good day today. All these things have to be reflected on, have to be evaluated, and they have to be looked in what the school improvement plan is going to take forward. And I must admit, our school improvement plan is reflecting health and wellbeing, positives for all, equity and fairness, and also recovery from trauma. So we're hopefully, we need that balanced approach. and we need to recognise that teachers are anxious about delivering about this. Okay, thank you.
Okay, thanks very much, Joan. Again, I would invite people, if they have them, to post questions to me in the chat box. Joan, can I ask a question while people are maybe gathering their thoughts about what they would like to ask? Can I ask you just to say a little bit about hub provision and what your impressions were when you were involved in that, in terms of like how children were being impacted by this, or even in your sort of like one-to-one online engagements with kids? Like what's your sense of how these kids who are living in poverty are being impacted by, you know, what is happening just now?
Well, a lot of some of the children that we referred to the hub that we were there, they weren't the ones that were the vulnerable children that were going, and some of them actually didn't access that. They didn't access the hub. So that was, you know, was strange. So a lot of the children there, they have to go because of their friends are key workers. But a lot of the children that I was working with in the hub were not children that I would identify as vulnerable. There was one wee boy there who, this was the first time he had been there, and he had challenging behaviour, and he found it really traumatising, you know, to be separated, to be in there, to be interacting, you know, with different people. So, you know, I can only imagine how challenging that was for other people with, you know, vulnerable children, you know. As I say, I get the impression that the vulnerable children weren't making the access to the hubs that they could have had, and for all different types of reasons.
I think you're right to point that out, Joan, because that was one of the ambitions of the Scottish Government just over the last couple of weeks, was to try to maximise the number of vulnerable children who were attending hub provision, because there was a recognition that they were largely absent, or they weren't attending in the numbers that had been envisaged initially. When you mentioned there trauma and maybe some behavioural needs amongst certain of those young people, that's one of the things that it's covered in the strategic framework on the guidance. Sorry, the strategic framework for the reopening of schools, providing a bit of guidance or signalling perhaps the need for additional staff to help cope with, or to help children cope with maybe some of the social and behavioural issues that they might have on their return to school, given the trauma that they've experienced, probably the ongoing tensions and anxieties that there are going to be about the virus, and about just kind of like going back to a more normal way of living, but it's still been a bit abnormal as well. So kids with behavioural difficulties are likely to struggle with that. What would be your thinking around, you know, that need for additional staffing?
Most definitely, and that has already been recognised within our school. You know, that need has to be there. We have to address the kind of resources that we're using to tackle that. My challenge for my children when I go back into school in August will be to make sure that these children are safe and settled, and that they're happy, and that you know, that'll be my focus, is to settle them and to make them feel they're safe and secure. Not worrying about, you know, the continuity of the learning and what they don't know their tables or their handwritings. It's to make them feel, because remember, they're coming into a completely different environment. A lot of the books, they won't be able to use the library, they won't be able to use the PE. When they go out into playgrounds, that will all be stipulated. It'll all be, you know, different for them, almost, you know, as if they're going into another surreal world. So it's trying to make, my job will be there to facilitate, to make them feel safe, you know, and to nurture them. And I'll already be putting things that we do mindfulness in our school. So part of our thing is daily mindfulness sessions with them.
So it sounds, Joan, like your school's got a really well established kind of like ethos of prioritising health and well-being. One of the participants has suggested that while there's a lot of rhetoric around that at the moment coming from government about what should be the centrality of health and well-being, there's a fear that perhaps it's about just getting numbers into school and maybe drilling them through literacy, numeracy, that kind of thing. How do you think that teachers can maybe be involved in conversations at school level to prevent that from happening?
I think, for instance, in their, you know, in their planning and their, you know, teacher engagement and their staff meetings and their school improvement plan discussions, I think when they're talking about, you you know, taking things forward. They have to actually, you know, we're talking about teacher professionalism. Teachers have to get up and speak about these things. These are the people, we're taking the words off the page. We are actually at the coal face delivering this. So if we're finding this, we cannot be saying these things and, you know, saying that we're not finding it happening in schools, but we have to verbalise it, we have to articulate it and to put it forward and actually sit down professionally around, you know, our tables and actually say, well, this is not working. First of all, we have to make sure that everybody is singing from the same song sheet. We're all practicing mindfulness. We're all doing, you know, our all our different, you know, health and well-being strategies that were put in place, and that should be in the forefront. It should be that first. You cannot take forward learning, education learning, if you don't have a happy and a healthy and a, you know, whole school. And that comes, and I'm talking about everybody in the school. I'm talking about the teachers, support staff, and the children.
Joan, do you see, you know, you're obviously a school rep. What do you see as being the role of EIS branches in, you know, helping schools to get the priorities right in terms of that balance when schools do reopen and over the months subsequent to that? How do we make sure that our branches are engaged in this?
In South Lanarkshire, we have a primary network. So what I do is we've already anticipated that. We've organised in August. We will have in our reps coming back, and what we do is we have our reps meeting, and on that reps meeting we'll be taking forward all the different things, the recovery plan, taking forward, you know, the blended learning, how that's finding it. And what we do through these meetings is we pinpoint different areas where we see maybe there's problems evolving, and we have a healthy relationship with South Lanarkshire. So what we can take forward, we can take back through our LNCT, and we can take these things on their behalf to say, well, this is what we're finding, this is what you're saying is happening in the recovery plan, the actuality is it's not. So this is where we disseminate all that information through our primary networks, through our EIS reps, and our branch meetings, so we can actually identify that.
Got a question, Joan, or a kind of beginnings of a question from a participant who is in a senior leadership team, just a bit worried about how we minimise the kind of like traumatic impact for kids on the return to school. So maybe in sort of like seeking to apply social distancing measures, you know, by setting out areas maybe and cordoning off certain areas, we might make the environment seem quite strange, unfamiliar, maybe kind of anxiety ridden for children. Have you any thoughts on how schools might overcome some of that? You know, still maintain social distancing, but to do it in a way that doesn't undermine the health and well-being of children further?
I think drama and role play are essential. I think for things like that, we can still do drama, we can do role play, we can do music, art, all those different things. One of the wee girls who's in our school and who's in the hub, but she's in the hub in our school as well, has what she loves to give a hug. She can't give a hug, but what she's developed is she does this. So she's got a wee symbol of hugging us, you know, when we come in. And we had, before pre-COVID, you know, our children all came in and they would opt to greet you in the morning, whatever way they wanted to, and most of them opted for a hug. So another way is being creative about that, is giving it back to the children. It's actually giving it back to them and saying, look, how do we get round this, guys? You know, what could we do so that we all feel as if, you know, we're together in this? This is weird. You know, I actually see giving it back to the children and involving them and making decisions about things like that.
My imagination was kind of like running a bit wild there, Joan, and I wasn't paying as close attention to the chat as I should have been. Yeah, I think that maybe the comment that you made about teacher health and well-being has struck a chord. There's a comment here about the importance of teachers looking after themselves, the importance of self-care. There's going to be a huge job ahead for teachers, and you know, a real resilience going to be required of them. There already has been, of course, but in order to sustain that, there has to be emphasis also on looking after teachers and the other adults in the school, so that the environment is safe and happy and secure for everyone. You've touched upon that a little bit. Any further comments you would make on that, Joan?
Yeah, and I think that starts at the top. That's our head teacher is amazing at doing this. I mean, she takes it on board, and she is, and the senior management team. of recognising that, you know, we can't function unless our own mental health and our emotional well-being is sound. So therefore she's very, you know, conscious of that and make sure that we're all looking after ourselves. That's why the mindfulness programme was put into our school, not just for the children, it was for us, you know, to make sure she recognises that our job is very stressful, and she recognises that because we work in an area of multi-deprivation, that these children are stressed. She knows that we're dealing with parents who need us and who need our support and think that we've got all the answers to it, you know. So that has to be our priority, and that should sit in school improvement plans as well. There should be a triangulation of that. It should be the children, the staff, you know, everybody coming together. We've all got to feel good. We're coming into, you know, the job feeling really anxious. I'm anxious about going back, you know. So it's a new way of teaching, not the teaching that we know, and I think we just have to all recognise that. Okay.
Joan, thanks very much for that. That was a lot of questions fired at you, and some really, you know, as you say, to use your phrase, from the coalface, kind of like, you know, sort of like meaty responses to them. So thanks very much for that. One thing that I would say about health and wellbeing is that if you haven't seen it already, EIS has got a working at home resource, and it's got 2 sections in it that are dedicated to teacher health and wellbeing. So if you haven't had a chance to look at that yet, please make sure that you do. And there's been a series of daily inspirations, you know, trying to encourage you to take 5 minutes, 20 minutes, half an hour every single day to do something that is about, you know, safeguarding, developing your health and well-being. And it's coming up to the summer holidays, so please make sure that you do it maybe in the countdown to the summer holidays and over the summer holidays as well, because it's going to be critical to you in the weeks and months from August.
I think there's been a lot of glib assumptions that this would be an easy sort by those that don't know education. And I think what certainly would have been the case, that the parents confronted with home learning will realise just the difficult skills that are involved and the demand that's involved in educating successfully. Another thing as well, I mean, a lot of younger kids learn by repetition. Learning by repetition then is something that we maybe take for granted in the classroom, but it might be seen by parents that don't understand that to be the teacher's been lazy, just giving the same exercises again, not understanding what the way in which children learn, the way in which professionals operate to reinforce that learning. So I think there's a lot of really difficult, you know, challenges that teachers have to grasp in trying to manage effectively, help the children learn effectively, also communicate to others what it is they're trying to do.
Yep, thanks very much for that, John. Thank you. Really insightful responses there to that series of questions. For those of you whose questions and comments weren't picked up there, what we'll do is we will put together some answers in response to those, and we'll email those out post the meeting. Okay, I'm now going to pass over to our next speaker, who is Sandra Scott. And as I mentioned at the beginning, Sandra Scott is one of the PACT project co-leaders. Her specific focus is pedagogy. She's a teacher. She's seconded from teaching, you know, to give her expertise to the project. And she is going to be talking about the devastation of COVID-19 so far in terms of its you know, interaction with the poverty pandemic that was here ahead of COVID. She's going to pass seamlessly over to our other co-leader, who is Kate Laughlin. Kate's area of expertise is around kind of like around community and community activism, and how that can be used as a force, you know, to combat poverty. And after both of them speak, again, there'll be time for us to pick up questions that have come into the chat box over the course of their 2 presentations. So I'll hand over in the first instance to Sandra. Thanks, Sandra.
Good evening, colleagues. So my project co-leader, Kate, and I would like to talk to you some more about the pandemic's impact on poverty, education and community. And like Joan, we really like to talk about difficult topics through metaphor. See, I'm still very much an English teacher at heart. And so today we're going to find ourselves emerging from the storm and then surveying the devastation and starting to rebuild for the future. So I'm going to take you on the first part of this journey, and then I'll pass you over to Kate. So why the storm metaphor? Well, it comes from the Joseph Rowntree Foundation, who have done a lot of work on poverty. And we're using it as a powerful example of how we might be able to reframe the narrative around poverty. And the BBC Newsnight presenter Emily Maitlis used this metaphor as well and really unleashed a storm of protest. So just to remind you what she said, they tell us coronavirus is a great leveller. It's not. It's much, much harder if you're poor. How do we stop it making social inequality even greater? The disease is not a great leveller, the consequences of which everyone, rich or poor, suffered the same. It's a myth that needs debunking. Those on the front line right now, bus drivers, shelf stackers, nurses, care home workers, hospital staff and shopkeepers, are disproportionately the lowest paid members of our workforce. They're more likely to catch the disease because they're more exposed. Those who live in tower blocks and small flats will find the lockdown a lot tougher. Those who work in manual jobs will be unable to work from home. This didn't go down well with the privileged. Kate and I will be touching on some of these issues here tonight. I feel like we're now all emerging from a traumatic experience, and it'll leave its mark on all of us. The easing of lockdown is still unpredictable and anxiety provoking, and we're all looking ahead to the next term with some trepidation. So just to stay with the Joseph Rowntree Foundation for a second, poverty was here before the outbreak, and we need to make sure it's not forgotten about or indeed made worse as recovery begins. We need to think about how society needs to change, and we need to do that by connecting the past, the poverty that's been created and revealed by the pandemic, the present, the action we should take right now, and the future, thinking about the values and outcomes that matter to us all. Because when the lockdown is over, when the pandemic is over, and the emergency response is over, we know that for millions of people, poverty will not be over. And when this response to the coronavirus outbreak passes into history, we want it to include the crucial role of teachers protecting their students from harm through supportive policies and practices. We mustn't underestimate the ongoing dual disadvantage here. The impact of poverty is now being felt by new groups who may not have experienced it before, and there's some interesting effects there. So now self-employed people are receiving around £94 per week under the coronavirus support scheme, and suddenly we see the beginnings of an outcry. How will these hard-working entrepreneurs survive? Well, it's not easy surviving on £94 a week. No one wants to be in that position. However, this shows up a sinister connection to the old narratives of the deserving and undeserving poor. And I can't help noticing that there's been much less of an outcry about the even lower amounts of money people have had to survive on in the benefits system. And worse still, people had to survive on these inadequate benefits long before COVID-19, and they'll have to find ways to survive on this amount for a long time to come. It's quite interesting that all working age benefits payments rose by 1.7% on the 6th of April this year. That was the first increase since 2015. And so for 12 months, the government's increasing universal credit payments by around £80 a month. You know, I'm left wondering why. And we can tell you more about the figures in our later discussion. In this pandemic, we're seeing the crucial role of cleaners, shop workers, delivery drivers, and many others in low paid and insecure work. People who are already pushed towards the financial brink are keeping everyone going and facing growing challenges themselves. A sudden increase in pressure caused by this pandemic, like job loss or ill health, can quickly become a flood that pushes us into much deeper hardship. People in these jobs are already battling a rising tide of high rents, growing bills, and juggling health conditions and caring responsibilities. People in more deprived areas are less likely to have jobs where they can work from home, and this means they have to face a very significant drop in income or keep going to work and face greater risks of catching the virus. Additionally, they're also more likely to live in overcrowded homes, increasing the risk for whole families. We came across a Facebook post that we feel highlights these challenges really well. I'm standing outside a tower block in Bristol in the sunshine, waiting in line outside the chemist. All the windows of the block are open. All I can hear is the relentless tantrums of young children trapped indoors in a small space. Whoever thinks this as a leveller needs to spend a day as a single parent in such conditions. These parents are heroes. So one of our anti-poverty partner organisations is the Poverty Truth Community. And they carried out some research recently for their June 2020 report. And they spoke to young people and their families, and we thought we'd share some of these with you. This one particularly hit home for me as a secondary teacher. Being a teenager at this time is hard. I've had to grow up so fast. I worry about how my mum and I are going to make our money just last a little bit longer. About how if I have a bag of sweets now, it means we can't have a jug of milk later. I have such terrible guilty feelings. I'm hungry, but I don't want to have to eat so much because she's hungry too. And we know this experience will weigh heavily on her for a long time to come. So at the moment, our social media feeds are filled with stories of compassion and bravery and selflessness. And we see many community organisations rallying round to support people. Schools are part of these initiatives too. And some of you may be in schools that are involved in things like this. Many of these activities are new and they're responsive to local need. And this picture is from one of our partners in Castlemilk in Glasgow. And, you know, as a society, we're rightly proud of everyone who is working against the odds to keep society going, but we need to call for justice as well as compassion. When we were looking at the mainstream media reporting of the pandemic, we came across this on social media. If someone says it's raining and another person says it's dry, it's not your job to quote them both. Your job's to look out the window and find out which is true. As teachers, we need to trust our own eyes, ears and instincts. We know our own communities. However, drowning doesn't always look like drowning, and poverty isn't always obvious, especially if your school's in an affluent area. Now I'm going to hand you over to Kate, who's going to pick up on the importance of whose narrative we hear and whether that mirrors the real life experiences of too many of our young people.
Thank you, Sandra. So I want to talk a little bit more about the importance of the narratives we hear about poverty, narratives which our young people cannot entirely escape. Here are some common beliefs about poverty. Here are some common beliefs about poverty which I'm sure will be familiar to all of you. Credit to the Joseph Rowntree Foundation for the Reframing the Poverty research, which once again this is taken from. So these seem to sort of sum up three big groups of beliefs. So people don't believe poverty exists today in this country. We're hoping, from what we've heard tonight, and generally that is lessening, but that is a predominant belief amongst certain groups of people in society. You'll have heard these things. People blame individuals for being in poverty. They should try harder and work more. They could, you know, pull themselves up by their bootstraps. Or fatalism, the game is rigged. People think there will always be poverty. Nothing will ever change. The combined effects of these beliefs is that poverty can get dismissed out of hand or is seen as inevitable and impossible to change, according to JRF, and we agree with that. So what we want to do is actually look at ways to reframe the narrative in poverty. Here's another one of their images. This is from before the current crisis and argues for reframing poverty as people being stuck or trapped, to have a different way of looking at it. That makes sense generally, but think how much more are people being squeezed after 3 months of lockdown? How many people have been literally trapped in overcrowded houses with perhaps poor sound insulation, with inadequate energy supplies, not to mention potentially not enough food, perhaps needing nappies, sanitary protection, toiletries, light and gas a problem, internet, we've talked about some of these issues. And of course, it has been hard for everyone, even those with maybe a garden, car, a big house with various rooms, online shopping resources, access to children's resources, even maybe the odd bottle of wine, and of course Wi-Fi and devices. How many young people have endured their own stress and worried desperately about the stress of their parents and families and those kinds of circumstances where poverty is an additional issue? So there's a thought here for the profession, we think, for everyone working in education, about looking at some of our frameworks and perhaps incorporating some of the other things we want to talk about tonight into that. So part of our narrative, let's look at the one that we're all familiar with first of all, the United Nations Convention on the Rights of the Child. So the Children's Commissioner for Young People in Scotland has posted some concerns that they have about some of the children's rights within the Convention and their concerns to make sure that these are realised. You'll be familiar with most of them. I have the right to an education, I have the right to an education which develops my personality, respect for others' rights and the environment. I have the right to good quality healthcare, clean water and good food. I have the right to have a proper house, food and clothing. And my family should get the money they need to help bring me up. And here's a crucial question. Do we see these rights being fulfilled? And also, how can we respect and fulfil these rights for children and our young people within families and communities whose human rights are being violated on a daily basis through poverty themselves? As John has said and others, the poverty that existed prior to this crisis has not gone away. Indeed, for those in poverty, it has inevitably got worse. And for those who are just about breaking even, on that phrase, many have now faced or worry that they're about to face poverty in the near future. And as we've talked about, it is people in poverty who are dying disproportionately, as Andrea referred to also at the beginning of this session. And according to the latest figures, as we said, those in the poorest areas are about twice as likely to die from coronavirus than most in the most well-off areas. So all in it together, eh? So let's look at this, surveying the devastation when we start to emerge from the storm, when we return to school next term. Perhaps it's also a good time to survey the devastation of human rights. The PACT project takes a human rights approach to poverty, which we could call the Convention of the Rights of the Child and beyond. We recognise that if we are serious as a society about fulfilling the rights of the child, we must also be serious about fulfilling the rights of their families and communities too. Children do not live in a vacuum, as we know, and children become those adults in turn. We mean internationally recognised human rights, such as the right to an adequate standard of living, the right to social security, right to just and favourable conditions of work, the right to the highest attainable standard of physical and mental health, and the right to take part in the cultural life of their country, just to use examples. So before we move on to the next section, here's another boat image, an anchored and steady boat this time, thanks to JRF once again. This can be looked at in many ways. They all matter more than ever. For example, we can think about a teacher or teachers being a young person's anchor, a school community helping to anchor a family, school and the wider community together providing the anchor, and human rights anchoring them all in turn. More on that shortly. So as we move on to the next section, as the writing on the wall says, are we really waiting for a return to normal, or are we ready to build something different? Rebuilding together for the future. And the understandable drive to normalise and to provide as much stability as possible for our young people, we also have a potential chance to change some things for the better before the new normal sets in again. We have a chance to look beyond. There's that phrase again. To understand more of what our young people and their families and communities have experienced surviving the double whammy of poverty and the lockdown, and bearing in mind that for many groups of young people there has been a triple whammy of health, caring, and a wide range of additional support needs to contend with too, all of which, as we know, are exacerbated by poverty. Many are seeing, perhaps for the first time, invisible levels of poverty being made visible, and we can grasp that moment. We can refuse to ignore the elephant in the classroom when we return. Let's think about the earlier quote from Larry, where he talked about obviously that all children have been traumatised, but the particular emphasis on those who are coming from the sort of backgrounds that we are concerned about in this session tonight. Let's look at another quote from the Poverty Truth community from another of our young folk. I'll give you a moment to see that. And therein lies another aspect of the problem. The narrative has been for too long that poverty is somehow normal and even inevitable, that violations of children's rights, of human rights, are normal. Many communities and schools have been forging partnerships and working together, and in doing so, often forging novel forms of a new but very old narrative of caring for your neighbours, of rallying round, of making sure no one is left out. We're familiar with the valuable previous cost of the school day work from our own EIS and from our partners, Child Poverty Action Group, as well as from local councils and so on. Some of you will have done their training. But there is another framework and another narrative that supports those. And in the midst of all the other strains and pressures of returning, it's crucial that we don't lose sight of it. A framework that is very much a rights-based narrative. In poverty proofing, as Joan so eloquently emphasised, or being poverty sensitive, and remembering the elephant in the classroom, there will be an increased need to meet children and young people where they are at, as we know. And this could be an opportunity for schools to further enhance the sense of schools and communities working together, of showing respect for the sense of place where our young people live, and of not allowing that outpouring of community spirit to go unnoticed. Actions and conversations underpinned by a real sense of community in place can provide opportunities for schools to build on the good work they've already been doing and to embed their role within the community even more. Here's one example of some of the things going on in one community. Within our communities, established organisations are doing new things, making new partnerships, while grassroots groups are springing up. What is out there in all our communities? Using this as an example of what the First Minister has said about a chance to build things better, and connecting back in schools in the classroom, we have an opportunity to listen to what support has been or has been not out there, to acknowledge what has been the reality of our children's lives as they are lived in their families and communities, including of course online during these times, and to further enhance our embeddedness within our communities. Leaving that slide there for a moment, crucial to change is the power to present different narratives, as we know. To imagine that things could or even better can be different. In schools, that requires everyone to share a narrative. However, there are so many overlapping and sometimes seemingly competing narratives. Examples include the curriculum for excellence, of course, closing the attainment gap, or empowering schools and collegiate working agendas, nurturing schools, rights respecting schools, the importance of parental and community engagement, the Head Teachers Charter, the new Fairer Scotland duty, and more. But it's commonly accepted, perhaps more now than ever, that poverty, in some form or another, is standing in the way of fully realising the ambitions of all of these. Let's return to poverty then. Imagine reframing the narrative there in a way that doesn't conflict and indeed may potentially help us fulfil our other frameworks and commitments. Poverty is a violation of human rights. This is not rhetoric. It's enshrined in international treaties agreed and ratified by the UK government. All the human rights I mentioned earlier were quoted directly from one, the International Covenant on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights, which is one of 3 foundational human rights documents comprising the International Bill of Rights. And the UK's 5-year performance review before the United Nations comes up next year, 2021. Civic society is already preparing for that because there are deadlines to meet and reports to go in. EIS is taking a human rights approach to poverty. Children do not live in a vacuum, and the Scottish Government is committed to a human rights-based approach, and that's reflected in the Fairer Scotland duty. So the Fairer Scotland duty is still in the implementation phase. Some of you will have heard of it, perhaps some of you may not. So what is the Fairer Scotland duty? It places a legal responsibility on particular public bodies in Scotland, local authorities are one of them, to actively consider, to pay due regard to how they can reduce inequalities of outcome caused by socio-economic disadvantage when making strategic decisions. And there are a series of reporting mechanisms in the system on those. So we start from the point of view that human rights are not optional. So on that basis, PACT is about trying to change the narrative on poverty. A narrative that's based on rights, not charity, a human rights-based approach that supports and contextualises the United Nations Convention on the Rights of the Child and goes beyond, that supports the Fairest Scotland duty and supports our nurture and wellbeing programmes and the other frameworks and initiatives mentioned. We are busy developing support and awareness-raising resources and providing both domestic and international evidence-based research and information on principles, policy and practice, and believe potentially it could be truly transformational in poverty. Now, as we emerge from this crisis, in which the poverty on our doorsteps is more visible and urgent than ever, we believe it's time to tell a different story in poverty, and especially to and for our young people. One that emphasises and reflects and includes their place within their families and communities, and which acknowledges the empowering importance of all our roles in moving towards building a better future for and with them from this crisis. Over to you. What do you think? Thank you.
Thanks very much there to Sandra and Kate. I hope that you found their presentations illuminating. There were certainly a few interesting questions coming up as you were speaking. One of them relates to rights and the erosion of rights that Kate, you referenced in your presentation. And there's a question from one of the participants about how can rights that have been eroded over the course of this pandemic be reinstated? How do you see schools contributing to that process? So there's maybe a bit to come from both Kate and Sandra in relation to that.
I'm happy to go in first, if that's okay.
Sure.
There are numerous ways that we can do this. I mean, there are some really interesting research papers out there, some of them looking at the Scottish dimension in particular, and obviously we have a lot to learn from what's happening in other countries too about the emphasis in human rights education. There is a human rights declaration on human rights education and training, which involves schools and young people. So there is work to be done looking at the issues of human rights education, and some of those research papers have argued for the importance of human rights education and teacher training. And human rights education encompasses three things. One is about human rights, so people have to know their rights in order to claim them, and children have to know their rights, not only the rights of the child, important though that is, but the rights that their parents have a right to expect, the rights that they have a right to expect for their communities and when they're adults. So there is a whole programme out there about human rights education. There is also the very importance of changing the narrative, which is what we're talking about using human rights language and using a human rights approach. And that's very much in line with the drive that's coming from the Scottish Government at the moment as well, that is actually setting an example in the UK around developing a human rights narrative. So there's also been able to feed into the monitoring process. For example, we as an organisation, if we chose to, could contribute to that process, which is coming up next year, where civic societies do talk about the concerns in relation to poverty, and they are presented to the United Nations and are part of that monitoring process. And there are other things, but I think we start by using the language, changing the narrative, and for some people that this is very demanding and is quite radical and revolutionary, but we are committed to human rights, so I can't see why we aren't doing it, to be honest, as a society and as a country. So and that's where I would start.
Sandra, any further thoughts to contribute to that one?
I think this is particularly, the rights issue is particularly important for our bilingual minority ethnic students, because some of the awareness of the rights is something that's really been missing for a long time. And I feel that in the current political context, then, what an opportunity.
Of course, there's also Scotland's adoption of the UNCRC from, I think it's August of this year. I know that Education Scotland is interested in working with, I think it's the Youth Parliament or the Children's Parliament to put together a resource for teachers, and they were looking to work with us around that to help support work in relation to rights-based education and that very question about how you equip young people with the knowledge and the understanding of their rights in order that they can be better positioned to realise them. So there's that opportunity as well. Just when you mentioned political context there, Sandra, there's a nice segue there into the next question. One of our participants has highlighted the political expediency and political trickery that's going on at the moment, where political parties that have barely been concerned about poverty and child poverty before now, and in fact they've been the architects of much of it, are now purporting to be very, very concerned about it in order to get schools reopened and mums and dads and grannies and granddads back to work. Any comments to make just on that political kind of reality that we're seeing at the moment in terms of the discourse?
Can I come in on this one? I'm just thinking of the recent stories about the free school meals and the very different approaches by the UK government and the Scottish government on the free school meals money for over the summer. And it's really reassuring that here in Scotland families are going to have cash payments so they can have freedom and choice and dignity and to buy appropriate foods for their families and so on. And it's quite a contrast from politicians having to make a U-turn to even give vouchers at all.
Yes, I would just like to say that what's going on is an example of the people recognise, those in power recognise how important it is to have the right narrative. And my own background's in psychology, but you will know this as teachers. I mean, our minds work around narrative, and so I think that we're rightly taking an emphasis on the importance of narrative, but a narrative that reflects reality, not a narrative that is, made up and doesn't really, when you look outside, it's not really raining and you're seeing it as basically, to pick up Sandra's earlier slide.
John, I see that you've put a really potent comment in the chat box for everyone to consider. Do you want to elaborate a little bit on that just now?
Sure. I'm an optimist by nature, so this runs against the grain a little here. But I mean, if we look at what happened in the 1970s, and to some extent also what happened in the more recent times after the financial crash, is that attitudes towards poverty can harden slightly. And so rather than people, for example, that have maybe experienced poverty or experienced a loss of living standard for the first time, doesn't necessarily mean they'll be more understanding and looking to build a future that's greater for all. What often happens is people hold on to their own turf and fight for their own ground. I think you'll get powerful interests in society that will be arguing that common sense economics of the economy comes first. We can't afford this. It's a nice idea, but it's not the right time for it. And so the quest to build a better future, which I think is what we should be working for, will not be easy. And there'll be strong counter-prevailing argument that will be looking to get back to the status quo as quick as they possibly can. And I say I'm not a pessimist by nature, but I think the reality is history tells us that there'll be powerful forces that want the status quo back ASAP.
Yep, thanks very much for that, John. I'm just going to start to bring the webinar to a close. What you will have noticed, several people have alluded to the metaphor of the ship and the storm and so on. I'm going to borrow on that same metaphor in order to do that. So we're thinking storm. It's a type of weather, isn't it? So John's presentation was very much about having predicted that weather. Having signalled, he and other anti-poverty experts had signalled that all of these issues were with us prior to the pandemic. Then of course the COVID-19 storm raged and wreaked destruction and havoc, continues to do that for many families in Scotland, for many families south of the border also. And so while in this webinar we've done a bit of surveying the wreckage, surveying the damage, there's a fair bit more of that to come, because as you know, the virus hasn't been beaten yet. So to some extent, there's going to be a cold wind that blows for a lot longer than the initial storm. And of course, we have to be mindful of the fact that further storms might brew, because there could be a second wave of this and further devastation wreaked upon, you know, communities, families, individual children and young people. But you know, we've at least this afternoon thought about that. We thought about what came before COVID-19. We thought about what the PACT project was endeavouring to do pre-COVID-19, and we've outlined for you certainly the beginnings of the ways in which the PACT project is going to try to respond to the situation that we're in currently, and to make sure that what is offered next session takes very careful account of the experiences that children and young people, their families and communities have recently had and will continue to have in the months ahead, so that teachers are as equipped from engagement with the PACT project as they can possibly be, in order to be able to combat some of that at school.